A 3-inch part. That's all it took to kill 15 people. On November 4th, 2025, UPS Flight 2976, a McDonnell Douglas MD-11 cargo jet, lost its left engine during takeoff from Louisville. The engine flipped over the wing, trailing fire while the aircraft reached just 30 feet before plowing into an industrial complex. The NTSB has now confirmed that Boeing documented 4 previous failures of this exact component on 3 different aircraft. They issued a service letter in 2011. They designed a better part, but they never banned the old one. The question that keeps me awake? Why not? The flight was routine. UPS 2976, a scheduled cargo run from Louisville Muhammad Ali International Airport to Honolulu, Hawaii. An 8.5-hour journey across the Pacific, carrying up to 20,000 packages and 38,000 gallons of jet fuel. The aircraft, our registration N259UP, was a 34-year-old MD-11F originally delivered to Thai Airways in 1991 before conversion to a freighter for UPS in 2006. It had accumulated 92,992 flight hours and 21,043 cycles, well within its operational limits. 3 crew members were aboard. The weather was clear, winds calm at 6 knots from the southeast, visibility 10 miles. At 5:13 p.m. local time, the aircraft began its takeoff roll on runway 17R. Everything looked normal, until it wasn't. The MD-11 accelerated down the runway, reaching approximately 186 knots ground speed. As the aircraft rotated, lifting its nose for departure, something catastrophic happened. Airport surveillance cameras captured the moment. The left engine, along with the bulk of its pylon, separated from the wing, but it didn't simply fall away. The engine and pylon assembly flipped upward, arcing over the wing's leading edge, trailing flames as it tumbled through the air before crashing onto the grass beside the runway. Simultaneously, fire erupted at the pylon attachment point on the wing. The aircraft, now missing one of its 3 engines and with its left wing compromised, struggled to climb. Flight data indicates it reached approximately 100 to 175 feet, barely clearing the blast fence at runway's end. The crew had no options. V1, the decision speed after which takeoff cannot be aborted, had already passed. They were committed to flight in an aircraft that could no longer fly. The left main landing gear struck the roof of a UPS supply chain warehouse, carving a 300-foot gash through the structure. The wing then hit fuel tanks at Kentucky Petroleum Recycling, igniting a massive fire. The aircraft rolled more than 90 degrees to the left before crashing into a semi-truck parking area and Grade A auto parts, a scrapyard. The debris field stretched 3,000 feet south-southeast from the warehouse. All 3 pilots aboard were killed instantly. 12 people on the ground also died, including one who succumbed to injuries 51 days later. 23 others were injured. Witnesses described explosion after explosion, a chaos of fire and debris that seemed endless. The fireball was visible for miles. The data tells us what happened, that the question is why. The NTSB's focus immediately turned to the pylon aft mount, the structural assembly connecting the engine pylon to the underside of the wing. This mount consists of 2 critical components, a pair of lugs that bolt together, and within those lugs, a spherical bearing assembly. Think of the spherical bearing as a ball joint, allowing the engine to move slightly under stress while remaining firmly attached to the wing. Investigators recovered the fractured components. What they found was damage. The lugs had fractured completely. The spherical bearing race, normally a single piece of metal housing the ball element, had broken into 2 sections, a forward piece and an aft piece. The interior surface showed evidence of fatigue, cracking originating around the entire circumference at the edge of a design feature called the recess groove. This wasn't a sudden failure. The cracks had been growing for months, perhaps years, invisible beneath the surface until the remaining metal simply couldn't hold anymore. The fatigue cracking encompassed roughly 75% of the fracture surface. The remaining 25% showed overstress failure, meaning the final break occurred when normal takeoff loads exceeded what the weakened part could bear. Here's where this investigation takes a troubling turn. On February 7, 2011, Boeing issued service letter RWAMRD 11SL54100 for EPRU-A. The document informed operators of 4 previously reported failures of this exact spherical bearing assembly, part number S00399-1, on 3 different MD-11 aircraft. Each failure had initiated at the same location, the design recess groove on the interior surface of the bearing race. Boeing's assessment at the time? The failures would not result in a safety of flight condition. Think about that for a moment. A part that connects a 14,000-pound engine to the wing, a part that had failed completely on 4 separate occasions, why it was deemed not critical to flight safety. Boeing updated the maintenance manual to include visual inspection for bearing migration during routine 60-month checks. They also designed a new bearing assembly, part number S00399-523, which eliminated the problematic recess groove entirely. But they never prohibited operators from replacing failed bearings with the old design. They simply recommended the new part if an unserviceable bearing was discovered. Former FAA and NTSB investigator Jeff Wizzetti points to an earlier document that complicates this picture. In 1980, McDonnell Douglas itself issued a service bulletin identifying failures of the spherical bearing race as a safety of flight condition. 15 years later, Boeing determined the same type of failure posed no such risk. I just think it raises questions regarding the adequacy of the severity of the 2011 service letter, Guzzetti said, and it also raises questions about how UPS incorporated that information and acted upon it. N259. UP did not have the redesigned bearing installed. The NTSB is now investigating whether UPS had installed the improved part. A third theory considers whether the maintenance intervals themselves were adequate. The last visual inspection of the left pylon aft mount was performed in October 2021. A lubrication task on the spherical bearings was completed just weeks before the crash, in October 2025. But the more rigorous special detailed inspections, which would have examined the mount lugs and the outlet more closely, were not yet due. Those inspections are triggered at 28,000 to 29,200 cycles. N259 UP had accumulated only 21,043 cycles. In other words, the aircraft was fully compliant with all maintenance requirements. The fatigue damage that killed 15 people developed and propagated entirely within approved inspection intervals. As former FAA investigation chief Jeff Wizzetti noted, this part failed long before that interval. The weight of evidence points toward the spherical bearing assembly as the initiating failure.
¿Cómo que no te vayas? ¿Tú no sabes qué pinga más puede explotar ahí?
Exactly where
Vámonos echando.
Mira,
si esto sigue explotando.
2011 service letter had warned. The bearing race fractured circumferentially, splitting into 2 pieces that migrated forward and aft. This migration would have introduced play into the mount assembly, transferring abnormal loads to the lugs. The lugs cracked under fatigue, then failed catastrophically under the stress of takeoff. Boeing knew this failure mode existed. They designed a fix. They never mandated it. But there's something else that's been bothering me. The NTSB explicitly references American Airlines Flight 191 in its preliminary report. That crash occurred on May 25, 1979, at Chicago O'Hare. A DC-10, the MD-11's direct predecessor, lost its left engine and pylon during takeoff rotation. 273 people died, making it the deadliest aviation accident in American history. The cause was different. Improper maintenance procedures had damaged the pylon structure. But the outcome was identical. Engine separation at the worst possible moment.
What in the hell happened at the airport?
The FAA grounded all DC-10s, and they issued airworthiness directives.
Shit.
They changed maintenance procedures. The tragedy led to meaningful safety improvements that were incorporated into the MD-11 design. Hydraulic fuses were added to prevent the cascading failures that doomed the Chicago flight. But some things apparently didn't change. The fundamental pylon architecture remained similar, and when Boeing identified a recurring failure mode in the spherical bearing assembly, they chose a service letter rather than an airworthiness directive. Recommendations rather than requirements. A new part design that operators could choose to install or not. The 3 pilots aboard UPS 2976 were experienced professionals. Flight data shows all engine parameters were normal until 17:13:11, just seconds before impact. There was nothing they could have done. The failure occurred during the most critical phase of flight after V1, but before the aircraft achieved safe climb speed. They were the heaviest they would ever be, carrying maximum fuel for a trans-Pacific flight. They had almost all available power applied, and they were the lowest and slowest they would be until landing. When the engine separated, they had perhaps 2 seconds to process what had happened. The aircraft began rolling left from asymmetric thrust and the damaged wing. There was no altitude to recover, no time to troubleshoot. They rode the aircraft into the ground because there was nothing else they could do. The MD-11 itself has a mixed safety record. It was designed as an improved DC-10, addressing many of the earlier aircraft's shortcomings, but the type has been involved in several notable accidents over its 35-year service life, including the 1998 crash of Swissair Flight 111, which until Louisville was the deadliest MD-11 accident. Major airlines retired their MD-11s from passenger service years ago due to poor fuel economy compared to newer twin jets. The type found a second life as a freighter, where its 3-engine reliability and cargo capacity made economic sense. UPS operated one of the largest remaining MD-11 fleets. Following the crash, Boeing recommended grounding the type, and UPS complied on November 7th. The FAA issued Emergency Airworthiness Directive 2025-23-51, then expanded it to include DC-10 aircraft due to their similar pylon configurations. In January 2026, UPS announced the complete retirement of its MD-11 fleet. Every accident is a chain of events. Break one link and the outcome changes. Here the links include a bearing design with an inherent weak point at the recessed groove, multiple documented failures over decades, a service letter that recommended but did not require a redesigned part, maintenance intervals that did not catch fatigue, cracks developing faster than expected, and finally an engine that separated at the precise moment when the crew had no options left. For pilots and aviation professionals, the lessons from Louisville echo those from Chicago 46 years earlier. Maintenance matters, inspection intervals matter, and when manufacturers identify a failure mode, the industry's response matters. A service letter is not an airworthiness directive. Recommendations are not requirements. 15 people are dead because a 3-inch bearing, with a known history of failure, was still allowed to fly. The investigation continues. The NTSB's final report is expected in 12 to 18 months. Investigators are examining correspondence between Boeing and the FAA regarding the 2011 service letter. They're reviewing how UPS incorporated that guidance into its maintenance program. They're analyzing whether the inspection intervals were adequate for detecting the type of fatigue found in the failed bearing. What we owe the crew of UPS 2976, the ground workers at Grade A Auto Parts, the employees at Kentucky Petroleum Recycling, and everyone else whose lives were cut short that afternoon in Louisville, is a thorough accounting of what failed and why, and a commitment that when the next manufacturer identifies a known failure mode, the response will be more than a recommendation. When that final report is released, I'll be here to walk through it with you